Hi guys, it's Angie with Fun Endeavors Tie-Dye Lab. Today I'm making some thickened chemical water. For this project I'm going to use 1 quart of water, 3/4 of a cup of urea, and I'm going to ultimately end up using 3 teaspoons of sodium alginate. I have a link down below this video in the description for where I purchased the urea and the sodium alginate. Let me explain a little bit about the products that I'm using. Urea is a humectant, so it's going to help to keep the fabric damp and hopefully won't allow the fabric to dry until the dyes had plenty of time to react with the fabric and bond properly. Urea is also great to help dissolve dye, so if you have a color that's maybe a little harder to get into solution, you can make a paste with a little bit of urea water, and that will help to dissolve that dye and get it into solution better. I use urea in all of my liquid dye. I know some tie-dyers don't, and depending upon your climate, it may not be as important to use urea on a daily basis. But for me, I do. It's just kind of a habit that I've done because of the climate that I live in. The other item that I'm using is sodium alginate, which is made of sea kelp. The one that I use, I purchased from Amazon, and it's actually a food grade product. It's sold to thicken sauces and various things used in food production. Dharma Trading Company also sells sodium alginate, and they sell 2 different versions. They sell a high viscosity for cotton and a low viscosity for silk. I personally have never used the low viscosity because I don't dye silk. I'm mixing some dye to use as paint. So that's why I'm making this thickened chemical water. So I'm going to make it a little bit thicker than I would if I were just going to mix it as dye to use for tie-dye. Or if I was going to mix it just as thickened water to use to maybe keep the place on a shirt so that the dye doesn't run. Sometimes in a white area on the shirt, if you don't want any dye getting into that area, if you'll put a little bit of this thickened chemical water in that area, it helps to keep the other dyes from running and overtaking that part of the shirt. If you're just using it to keep the white space on a shirt, you don't have to add urea to the water. I'm starting out with 1 quart of room temperature water, and I'm measuring out 3/4 of a cup of urea into a plastic container. I'm going to pour just a little bit of the water into the urea. Then I'm going to use a plastic spoon to stir this mixture until the urea is dissolved in the water. Once most of the urea is dissolved, I'm going to add a little bit more water and continue stirring. As I continue stirring, you're going to see the water gradually start to clear up. It's still a little bit cloudy, but the more I stir, the more the urea dissolves and the clearer it gets. Once all of the urea is dissolved, I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of the water. Now I'm ready to add the sodium alginate. I like to add the sodium alginate in small amounts. I know I'm going to have to add quite a bit to this solution, so I'm starting off with an entire teaspoonful. If you notice when I add it to the urea water, it just sits on top. That's because sodium alginate is a little bit difficult to get mixed at times. So about the only way that I've found to actually get it mixed properly is to use some sort of a blender. In this case, I'm using an immersion blender. And if you'll notice too, when I move my hand, the blender part is plastic, so it's sticking to the outside of the blender. I'm going to go ahead and add a second teaspoon of sodium alginate to the urea water and continue blending. I'm going to use a plastic spoon to get part of the sodium alginate that's sticking to my blender off and try to make sure I get it off of the edges of my container. At this point, my chemical water is still pretty cloudy, but it's starting to thicken, and it will continue to thicken the longer I leave it alone. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this container into the refrigerator, and I'm going to allow it to thicken overnight. Do you see how this solution cleared up overnight? And it has continued to thicken some, but for the project that I'm working on, it's not quite thick enough. So I'm going to add 1 more teaspoon of sodium alginate to this container and use my immersion blender again. When you're making thickened chemical water, it's always good to leave it a little thinner and gradually add more sodium alginate as you need to. I'm going to continue mixing the chemical water, and then I'm going to put it back in the refrigerator and allow it to thicken overnight. You don't have to necessarily leave it overnight, but I would at least leave it for a couple of hours, and I wouldn't use it if it's still cloudy. I would wait until it clears up. You want to make sure that you have the sodium alginate mixed in really well. If I was going to use this solution to mix dye with and use for tie-dye, I would have added only 1, possibly 2 teaspoons of sodium alginate to this chemical water. That's probably enough sodium alginate added to the water as well if you were wanting to use it just to try to keep a white area white on the shirt. If you get your thickened chemical water too thick, it won't soak into the shirt. So if you're using it for tie-dye, there's kind of a fine line in there. If it's too thick, it's just going to kind of sit on top of the surface of the fabric and not soak into the folds. But like I said, I'm going to use this to actually paint dye with, so I want it to be pretty thick because I don't want it to run a whole lot on the fabric. And I'm only going through 1 layer of fabric, so it doesn't have to soak into more than 1 layer of fabric. When I use this thickened chemical water to mix the dye with for painting on the fabric, I'm going to add some soda ash along with the dye. So before I mix my dye, I'm going to set this container out and allow it to come up to room temperature. Otherwise, if I add the dry soda ash into the chemical water when it's cold, it's going to clump and not dissolve. Okay, so this is what it looks like now, and it has thickened up some, so I think it's perfect for what I need. From this point, you would go ahead and mix your dye like normal. Just use this chemical water in place of regular water to mix your dye for tie-dye. In my case, I'm going to use this to paint with instead of actually tie-dye with, so I'm going to do my process a little bit different. I'm going to go ahead and add soda ash in because I'm not going to soak the shirt. So I'm going to add both the dye and the soda ash into my thickened chemical water. So I hope this video helped answer some questions about how to make thickened water or thickened chemical water. And if you've enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate it if you would like it and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great day.